I'm Rafael.
I'm Kirk.
And this is the housing problem. In previous episodes of this podcast, and please do catch up now at thehousingproblem.com, we've spoken with congressmen, commissioners, community leaders, developers, and advocates from across New York City about the challenges that make up the housing crisis and the potential solutions to those problems.
But of course, the housing problem is really a national problem, one that folks are confronting in every state, at every level, from municipal governments all the way up to Congress and the White House.
It's so true, Kirk. And today, I couldn't be more excited about talking with someone who brings a truly unique perspective to the show, having worked to address the housing problem as both a mayor and as the federal housing secretary. In fact, our guest is the first White House cabinet member we've had on the show. I'm Rafael Castro. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Community Preservation Corporation. I've spent over 30 years working in affordable housing and community development, including time as the Commissioner of the New York City Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development.
And I'm Kirk Goodrich. I'm president of Monadnock Development, passionate about affordable housing, and been involved in affordable housing over 30 years.
And so together we have over 60 years experience working on housing issues in New York City, and are excited to continue the housing problem for season 3 as we look to try to continue to find solutions to the housing problem.
You know, we've spent the vast majority of the podcast series talking about local solutions to the housing problem. We've had really great conversations with New York City Chief Housing Officer Jessica Katz, New York City Controller Brad Lander, New York City Councilmember Pierina Sanchez, Ruth Ann Wisnowskis, who's Commissioner of the New York State Homes and Community Renewal. And in every town and city across the country, there are leaders who are focused on the housing crisis. But the fact is that it's a problem that's not going to be solved without help from the federal government as well.
And yeah, I mean, Kirk, this is something we've touched on a few times here on the housing problem, in particular when we spoke with Congressman Richie Torres all the way back in season 1. And he talked about the need for substantial federal funding to make the kinds of capital investments that our public housing stock so desperately needs. We haven't spent a lot of time talking in depth about the federal government, and there's really not a better guest to have on to have this conversation than the one we're going to have today.
And I want to jump right in and get into the introduction because I'm really excited about the conversation we're about to have. Our guest today was a member of the city council in San Antonio, a city of about 1.4 million people before becoming its mayor. It was during that time that he made a name for himself as a national leader in urban development by launching the Decade of Downtown initiative to drive investment in both the city center and in older neighborhoods. This ultimately resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars in private investment and thousands of new homes built in San Antonio.
And in 2014, President Barack Obama named him Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And if our listener hasn't figured it out yet, we're talking, of course, about Secretary Julián Castro, who was housing secretary from 2014 to 2016. Under Secretary Castro's leadership, the Federal Housing Administration lowered mortgage insurance premiums to make homeownership more affordable for responsible families and released HUD's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, an important tool intended to overcome patterns of segregation, promote fair housing choice, and foster more inclusive communities.
As a candidate for president in 2020, Secretary Castro really made housing a core pillar of his platform. What he called People First Housing included a wide range of interesting ideas, some of which we'll talk about today, including expanding the Housing Choice Voucher Program.
And I know he's a very busy man, so let's get right into it. Mr. Secretary, welcome to the housing problem. And I'm sorry to say, but our co-host, Kirk Goodrich, has either had technical difficulty or was going to get the pizza that he was having delivered to his office. One of the two, I'm not quite sure. But he's not going to be able to join us for this conversation. But I'm still excited to have it, and I look forward to talking to you about all things housing.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me.
We always start our episodes by asking our guests to talk a little bit about how their journey has affected their view of housing, their view of neighborhoods, communities, and affected their career choices and how they've done the things they do. And obviously, your life story is a fascinating one, and one that speaks to a lot of what is great about this country, but I'm sure it has also affected how you think about cities and communities and neighborhoods. And so, if you could just share with the listener a little bit about how that has affected, what your story is, and then how that's affected, how you think about the housing problem.
I feel like like a lot of other people, have lived an American dream story, that my family and I have lived that. I have a twin brother, Joaquin, and we grew up with my mom and my grandmother on the west side of San Antonio. My grandmother had come to the United States in about 1922 when she was 6 or 7 years old, because her parents had passed away. So she grew up with relatives that lived here in San
Okay.
Antonio. She never finished school, so she worked as a maid, a cook, and a babysitter for her career, and then raised my mom as a single parent. And my mom, raised us with the help of my grandmother. Joaquin and I went to the public schools there in the west side of San Antonio. The west side of the city was generally very Latino, very Mexican American
Mm-hmm.
community. When we were growing up there, probably 80% Mexican American. And as you can imagine, the public schools were not the strongest public schools.
Yeah.
In fact, we went to two public school districts that were at the center of a 1973 Supreme Court case. Parents had filed a lawsuit against Texas saying that those students had been shortchanged because the state wasn't investing enough in those schools and neighborhoods and so forth. Um, and I felt very blessed to be able to graduate from high school, go on to college, go on to law school, and then come back to San Antonio and jump into public service with the idea that I could play a role in helping to create more of that kind of opportunity for people that grew up in the city the way that I did, of different backgrounds. And that's what I worked on, as
Yeah.
a city council member, when starting at the age of 26, and then eventually as mayor of San Antonio for 5 years before becoming HUD secretary for President Obama in the summer of 2014. What I took away from my time growing up in San Antonio in the West Side, and then also as mayor and as HUD secretary, was how important it is to be able to be supported by your family, by your community, the neighborhood that you grow up in, the schools that you go to, all of the things that make opportunity possible.
Yeah.
And I see housing as completely fundamental to that. We know it empirically, we know it just commonsensically, we know it from experience, that when you have safe, decent, affordable housing, that makes it so much easier and more likely that you're going to be able to get a good education, that you're going to be able to get a good job, that you're going to have better health, that you're going to have those things that add up to great quality of life and living the American dream. And so that was really why I dedicated my time as mayor, trying to invest in neighborhoods, and then as HUD secretary, going around the country, doing what we could to make investments and also lay out a vision for greater housing opportunity in the United States.
And so, if I have it right, your mom was also she was an activist and a local political leader as well, right? So you have that sort of public service in your blood, at
Yeah,
a very early
I
age.
grew up with a hellraiser of a mom. When she
That's
was young,
great.
she was a Chicana activist. She was part of
Yeah.
the Mexican American civil rights movement, and she ran for city council when she was 23
Wow.
and didn't win. At that time, they had no single member district, so it was very hard for women and very
Yeah.
hard for people of color to actually win. But she made a run for it and
Good for
remained
her.
active even though she was not elected. And so Joaquin and I grew up in this household where participating in the democratic process was valued.
Yeah.
And we saw politics and public policy not as a headache or something to scoff at, but as essential to empowerment and to creating opportunity and getting ahead in the country.
Yeah. So I have to ask because it does seem a bit unique that two former mayors of San Antonio have served as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. I don't know that there's another city that has two mayors that have served there. So I'm sure you've been asked this a million times, but I'm just curious if you think if it's just happenstance or if there's something about San Antonio that leads to people that are like big housing
Henry,
visionaries.
Yeah, Henry Cisneros, who's a fantastic guy.
He's a great guy.
Served as mayor from 1981 to 1989. And he, in terms of people in politics, he was a big part of the reason that I jumped into local politics in the first place. Henry was a transformative mayor in San Antonio. The agenda that he had to create opportunity, not only in education, but economic development. And he cut a figure that was dynamic and spoke about the future and made a lot of people believe that, hey, if he can do that, I can do that too. Yeah. He was the first Mexican-American mayor of San Antonio in 100 years and the first Latino mayor of a major city. And then, of course, when he served at HUD, he brought the same energy. And when I got nominated, he was one of the first people that I met with and provided a lot of great advice.
That's great.
So I don't know what it is about San Antonio.
Yeah, I don't know. What
training ground.
It could be. I mean, it's interesting, right? And maybe we'll start here and sort of veer more into substantive topics. But when I think about his history, and he also, for me, growing up in a household with a Puerto Rican family and father, and I saw him as also this one of the original, sort of one of the early Latino political figures that you can sort of look to, and I was at my early infancy of really understanding and learning about housing and community development, and so spent time studying what had happened in San Antonio. But you also did an enormous amount around economic development in neighborhoods in San Antonio. Your Decade of Downtown initiative, which really brought both economic development and housing into the downtown. The work you did on the east side of San Antonio, and how all of the resources sort of comprehensively came together in that neighborhood. So I don't know, maybe there's something about Texas and San Antonio and its openness to these issues of housing and economic development and community development and how they intersect. But we have a very hard time in my parochial world of New York getting people to come together around things like downtown initiatives, and so talk a little bit about that, because I do think maybe there's something, as I think about it, there's something there about why you both rose up to the highest levels of housing in our country.
One of the things about San Antonio is that even though it's a city of now about 1.5 million people, in so many ways, it still feels like a smaller community. Yeah. There's still more of a sense of connection among people. The way that I describe it is that if two people pass each other on the sidewalk downtown, that they still look each other in the eye. Or if you're in a restaurant and you sneeze, 2 or 3 people still say bless you.
Right.
Or if your mail goes to your neighbor's house, the person will walk it over and put it back into your mailbox instead of writing, on their wrong address.
Yeah, not mine.
Redelivered. Yeah.
Right.
There's still more of a sense of connection. And for policy making, what that translates into is the ability to work together for the betterment of the community. I mean, like every place, it has its divisions, it has polarization sometimes, it has a lot of disagreement, but there's still more of a sense of let's do this for the community. Let's lift up the fortune of this entire community. There's also in our town, in our city, I think this underdog mentality. Um, and I say this lovingly as a San Antonian, sometimes even an inferiority complex. And there are real negatives to that, but one of the positives is that people want to, when they feel like, okay, we can do better, we can work together, they do come together to try and accomplish big things. And that's why I think that Henry was able to do good work. I know that it's why I was able to do some good work.
Yeah, it's interesting because at CPC now in my new role, while we're based in New York City, we work all across New York State, and I grew up in Rochester, New York, which is a smaller than San Antonio by a lot, but I often find that it's that same sentiment of the smaller places. People know each other. You see your neighbors all the time. There's more of a sense that we can work together, even if we don't disagree. That I think somehow is a challenge in a lot of places, in the country now. And so one of the things that I think you're uniquely positioned as a former city council member, a former mayor, and a former HUD secretary to talk a little bit about that I think the listener will appreciate is that, we spent a lot of time on the housing problem talking very parochially about New York's problems. And one of the things that we're trying to do this season is bring broader perspectives. And as New Yorkers, we have the opposite of an inferiority complex. We think we know everything. And the truth is that we don't. And so one of the things that I think you're uniquely positioned to talk a little bit about that we banter back and forth on the housing problem a lot is, what is the role of the federal government in helping us solve, at a very broad level, at helping us solve the housing problems that, by the way, are not just coastal city housing problems anymore. It's all across the country. Renters are struggling everywhere today. And homeowners are struggling and people are struggling to buy a home. And so, there's a lot that local communities can do. You did it as a mayor. We do it in New York. Lots of places do it. The local energy is really important. But that federal partnership, when I was in city government, I had a great federal partnership. And I felt blessed to have that because it's a moment in time. And I think, so I'm interested to hear your thoughts on sort of the role that the federal government can play in helping energize communities and helping solve the housing problem.
The role of the federal government is critical. It's indispensable. It's absolutely necessary if we're ever going to fully address and solve, if we can use that word, the housing problem in our country for different reasons. First of all, resource-wise, there's nobody else that has the resources to address this on the scale that it needs to be addressed. Making sure that the resources are there. Also, the tools that it has at its disposal, making sure that each of those tools in the toolbox can be used. Ensuring that there's investment everywhere in the country, because frankly, if left to their own devices, there are a good number of states, and Texas may well be one of them, where investment might be a lot less in affordable housing opportunity than it would be in a New York or California or other places. And so the federal government has many roles to play as an investor, equalizer, partner, but it is absolutely critical and indispensable to solving the problem. When I was HUD secretary, I visited 100 different communities, a lot of big cities, but also some smaller towns. And what I saw, and this is no surprise to y'all, is that it's not just the usual suspect cities that have a problem. We have a rental affordability crisis and a housing crisis across this country. Yeah, in New York City and Chicago and San Francisco and Seattle and LA, but also in places that are medium-sized, even some smaller towns. I remember visiting North Dakota, and a town in North Dakota that was in the middle of the shale boom there.
Yeah.
And being told about the man camps, for instance, there wasn't enough housing for the
Right.
workers there in the industry. I remember visiting small communities in the Midwest and hearing about how much rents had jumped over the last decade and that people could not find affordable housing, and when they always expected that they would be able to find it. So local communities have to do the work, states have to do the work, but the federal government absolutely has to be a big partner in all of it.
Yeah. So let's dig deeper a little bit, because the listener has heard me, some might say rant on about the biggest place in which I think the federal government has a huge role to play, because and I think it's the answer in a lot of ways to solving the housing challenges for the lowest income people in our country. And that's rental assistance. And I know you've been a big proponent of universal vouchers. I like to describe it in the following way, and then I want to hear your take, which is, if we had universal vouchers in this country, and we really committed to it, they should work like food stamps. If you're poor in this country and you can't afford food, you get food stamps, and you can go use them at any supermarket or grocery or bodega or anything, pretty much anywhere in the city. And the vendors take them because they're easy to get reimbursed on. The system we have in place right now for housing vouchers is both hard for the tenant to go through the process to get qualified and all the paperwork and all the questions we ask them and the way we do it. But it's also hard for the landlord because local public housing authorities that administer the Section 8 vouchers are tied up in regulation about how they can make payments, and it's a very challenging system. But more than even that, fundamentally, we don't have enough money allocated to it, and there are some estimates out there that suggest it's only $100 billion. And I say only because when you think about the total size of the federal budget, it's not really that much money to make housing vouchers universal. And so I really want to hear from you about sort of one, what you think I'm right about, wrong about. Where do you think the conversation has fallen down in Washington, and where you think maybe there's opportunity to think differently about how we achieve this goal of universal housing vouchers?
We need to use every tool in the toolbox. And I believe that universal housing vouchers would be a powerful tool to use. I mean, we've seen that the model of engaging the private sector to provide housing opportunity can be a very effective model to get affordable housing opportunity out there quickly, to deploy it with more choice for those prospective tenants, and to do it all over the country in places big and small. And I believe that if we were to universalize housing vouchers, it would have to come with some of basically the improvements that you talked about on all sides. Improvements with the application process and the vetting to make it both quicker and also ensure that we do it well and properly. Improvements in terms of cutting red tape for the landlords. That is a constant battle and something that HUD works on and housing authorities work on. But look, we're talking about the federal government, and I obviously I am progressive, but I also recognize that sometimes the federal government lives up to the critique of a lot of red tape. A lot of those rules are in there for a reason, and there was a good reason why they're put in place. But when they all start working together, it can create delays. It creates a bureaucracy, and then you add to that a lot of these agencies like HUD have been understaffed, and housing authorities in places have been understaffed. So there's fixing that. And then frankly, also there's fixing this on the landlord's end too.
Yeah.
We have a lot of landlords who still buy into the stigma of Section 8 residents. A lot of people now won't rent to
Agreed.
folks who carry a voucher. And in places where uh, cities have tried to pass source of income discrimination ordinances, those have been shot down by conservative legislatures and been opposed by the real estate industry. And so I understand where the concern is. Look, if you're a landlord and you say, oh, why do I want to deal? Sometimes it's legitimate. Sometimes it is the red tape that they object
Yeah.
to. Other times it's because they want to keep certain
100%.
people out.
Yeah, 100%.
So it's figuring out all of that. Another element of this, and this is somewhere where I think the federal government can do better and also the private sector can do better, is it's also true that if landlords are receiving and tenants are receiving government subsidy, basically, that you need to ensure that there's a certain quality of housing there. And we've been woefully inadequate in many cases of ensuring that basic level of quality is there in many of these dwellings. We're behind. And that has a real impact on the quality of life for families out there. So there's a long way between here and there, but I believe that that's what we should be marching toward, investing toward, improving toward in our country, because it would truly, if we can engage the public and the private sector like that, it would go so far to addressing the crisis.
Yeah, I agree 100% with everything you said, and I think it's also added to an added layer of complexity is that the definition of housing quality varies from state to state, community to community, neighborhood. Some cities have building codes that require certain things, others don't, right? I mean, there's such a wide range, and so that's true on every topic in this issue, and that's where it really gets complicated. I think and I'm interested in your reaction to this. My fear is that while I know housing authorities are working hard on it, and I know HUD's working hard on all of these issues all the time, no one really believes that we're ever going to get, even though Section 8, as you well know, started out as this bipartisan issue that was led by a Republican Congress in the 70s. No one really believes that we're going to get to a place where Congress embraces universal vouchers. And unless we're able to sort of break through that and people and folks actually believe that there's momentum towards that direction, I'm not sure the hard conversations about the things that we've just been talking about are really going to happen. And so I'm interested in your reaction to that, because I, as a local person, I've worked in local government. I sort of tend to view Washington as this place where housing issues go to die, not flourish and create vision and opportunity. There's a few exceptions, but it's a tough road.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah, no doubt. I mean, do I believe that something like that is going to happen anytime soon? No.
Yeah.
In Build Back Better, for instance, a couple of years ago,
Right.
when the conversation began, there was a huge investment in affordable housing opportunity that included supersizing some of these initiatives and making a lot greater investment, I think to the tune of $300 billion at one point, if you added in the tax credits and so forth. So we know that when we're talking about Washington and especially Congress and funding and policy changes, that you're talking about moving slowly, moving like you're in molasses.
Yeah.
But the question is, are you moving in that direction?
Yeah.
And I think we are moving in that direction. What's unfortunate to me, what gets to me is, why in the hell we have such a housing crisis and this affordability issue that affects so many families, Republicans, Democrats, independents, not only people who are low income, but also very much middle class.
Yeah,
too.
very much. Yeah.
And it's not a bigger priority for politicians at every level.
Yeah, it's
I mean,
amazing.
there are a lot of them that it is a priority, and it's becoming more and more of a priority. But it is so past time that people make this a top level, top three, top five policy investment priority. And there's so few places, so few states, and it doesn't happen in Washington, D.C. What's sad is that, in my mind, it seems like it's going to take millions and millions and millions of more families struggling, more people sleeping on the streets, more people doubling up, more people sleeping in their car before politicians of different stripes take this as seriously as they should and put as much resources and thought behind the policy and the cutting of red tape and everything else that goes into making it successful.
Yeah,
That's the travesty to me.
yeah, and I think it's I think it's in the next topic we talk about is plays into this too, but I think it's fundamental to the disconnect that you hear people talking about a lot between the low income folks and middle income, middle class folks and their government, right? There's this disconnect that
Sure.
exists and mistrust, right? And I think part of that is, and I think a big part of that is the housing problem that we have in this country, because what do you think about more than your house and where you live and where your family congregates and gathers? And if you don't have stability in that, everything else begins to crumble around it. And so I couldn't agree more. And there's probably no issue where this is even more acute than in the next issue that I want to just talk about and get your thoughts on, because Kirk talks all the time about how he grew up in Flatbush, Brooklyn, working class kid. His dad was a plumber. His mom worked in the hospital cafeteria, hospital services. They were able to buy a Caribbean American family. They were focused on trying to buy something. They were able to buy a home. His mom lived in that house until she passed. But he talks about all the time how in those kind of working class communities all over this country, those opportunities don't exist for the next generation of young families growing up who grew up in that neighborhood, maybe want to stay in that neighborhood, Kirk lives 4 blocks from the house he grew up in right now, maybe want to maintain that close connection, right? You grew up in a community where you had that close connection. You talked earlier about being raised by your mom and your grandmother in the neighborhood and the community. And it feels like that's falling apart. And it's largely, I think, centered around the lack of homeownership opportunities for people who want to own homes and put down roots in neighborhoods and communities. And that is only exacerbated in communities of color. The gap in homeownership between black and brown families and white families is, empirically, we all know this. We look at the data. It's inarguable, right? So one of the things we struggle with is how do you actually have an impact on that so that you can, advance homeownership in a meaningful way. It's a role that HUD plays through FHA. You worked hard to do some things when you were at HUD that don't sound super cool, but actually have a big impact in terms of reducing fees and things like that. But talk a little bit about homeownership, the importance of it, and sort of where you think the conversation needs to go so that we can do a better job of creating those opportunities for people in their neighborhoods that they want to live in and want to grow up in.
Home ownership is vital to people being more stable, I think, and to building generational wealth. When I got to HUD in the summer of 2014, we were, of course, coming off the years after the Great Recession. And we talk about, for instance, Black home ownership. And Black home ownership had gotten decimated in the Great Recession by more than, I think they've lost more than half of their value, home value, in the Great Recession. And the Latino community, communities of color, and communities of every stripe were affected by it. And there was a real stigma to promoting home ownership, because anytime you would talk about home ownership, the line on it would be, oh, well, you're encouraging people to take out loans that they can't afford, and that's going to cause the domino effect of now. That, first of all, that was never the entire reason why we had a housing crisis. There were bad actors in the corporate side that had a big role to play in that. And there was a narrative that I think overly blamed everyday Americans. Now, of course, there were people that bit off more than they could chew and so forth. But that narrative also had this effect of stigmatizing the idea of promoting home ownership. And so when I got there, I said that it was time to end the era of stigmatizing home ownership or promoting home ownership, that we could learn the lessons of the past and do things in a more careful, more cautious, more reasonable, and basically more regulated way, as long as you have smart regulation. And also make sure that people could continue to have that piece of the American dream of owning their own home, of being able to pass that on to their children and eventually their grandchildren. And I think helping to form strong communities, strong neighborhoods. Now, I have to be clear. I mean, you don't have to own a home to be a good, responsible, contributing member of a neighborhood. And so, sometimes people say, oh, what do you mean? You're talking about making it seem like only homeowners are good neighbors. No, not at all. Whether you own a home or not, you can be a good neighbor. But I do think that that it has a fundamental role to play in helping forge bonds and stronger neighborhoods and creating generational wealth in our country. And so that's a good thing. It's getting harder right now because interest rates, the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, I just saw it was over 7%, the highest it's been since the early 2000s. And so what do we do? What are the tools that we have? Well, the federal government has some important tools. You mentioned FHA. FHA used to be part of the problem when it was started in 1934. I mean, it basically contributed to redlining and the lack of opportunity for Black families. By the Obama years, more than 40%, I think it was like 45% of first-time Black homeowners were getting FHA insured mortgages. And the number was very similar for Latinos. So we saw that it could be a very powerful vehicle to create greater housing opportunity, home ownership opportunity. But you also need other initiatives that improve access to credit. In the private sector, you need educational initiatives to ensure that people understand, what they're getting into, and also demystify the process. A lot of people are first-time home buyers, and they're worried about taking on that commitment. You want to make sure that they understand it and that they're going to be responsible home buyers and homeowners. We need to do all of those things, and also everything else that we talk about to make sure that there's more affordability when it comes to buying a home.
I totally agree with your point about this is not about homeowners being better or worse neighbors than renters. Excuse me. It's about housing choice and housing opportunity for people that want to buy a home. And it's about building wealth. And we all know that in this country, the single greatest way in which all of us build wealth is through homeownership. That's the way it's been. That's the way our system is set up. And I think for everyday Americans, that's why it's the American dream. It's less about the actual deed and owning it than it is about this opportunity to build wealth for your family and economic stability for your family. So in the couple minutes that we have left, and this has been I will acknowledge that for the listener, this has been an odd episode because due to technical difficulties, my way more talented co-host, Kirk Goodrich, has not been able to join us. But one of the things that he really wanted to hear you talk about was the broadband initiative that you sort of took up the mantra of, while you were at HUD, to create more internet access, high-speed internet access in poor and working class communities all across the country. And obviously that initiative, people have been talking about this, the digital divide for a while, but it became really apparent how important this was during the pandemic, where if you lived in certain zip codes and were in certain school districts, remote learning was not able to happen because so many students didn't have computers, they didn't have internet access and all of those things. And so, it's not necessarily a housing topic, right, in and of itself, but it is a hugely important part of what we describe as a neighborhood being a bundle of goods. We talk about this on the housing problem a lot, and it's not just about the house you live in, but it's the schools, it's the community, it's the institutions, and it's things like broadband access in today's world. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit about that initiative and why you thought that was so important and why you think it's so important today. And, how do we get there so that we shouldn't be talking about this still, given the amount that technology has changed all of our lives over the, last 20 years.
Yeah, so I'll start out with a line that people have probably already heard a million times, folks say, which is that we know that in the 21st century that broadband is not a luxury, that it's a necessity.
Yeah.
Your listeners have probably heard that many times by now. And the Biden administration just rolled out an effort and investment to ensure broadband is available everywhere to everyone. But it's true. You hear it because it's true.
Yeah.
Whether it's a kid doing their homework or an adult applying for a job or trying to do a GED program or college or everything that we saw in the pandemic with virtual learning, you need it at home.
Yeah.
And doing it off a little phone, sometimes that's fine, but that doesn't suffice many times.
Right.
So when I got to HUD, I was super excited about working on an effort to ensure that people living in public housing had access to broadband, because the vast majority of people living in public housing don't.
Yeah.
And that's doubly hard on these kids who already, are facing so many long odds.
Yeah.
So HUD worked with other agencies and had great leadership in the White House. In the summer of 2015, President Obama announced Connect Home. Connect Home was a pilot project of 28 different communities, 27 different cities and towns, and one tribal Indian reservation in Oklahoma, where we were connecting up people living in public housing to broadband. It was a public-private partnership with HUD, housing authorities, nonprofits, and with internet service providers to deliver that broadband either totally free or extremely low cost. And I'm happy to say that thousands and thousands of families signed up then, have continued to sign up. Also happy to say that even though, as you can imagine, I disagreed with many of the things that Secretary Carson and the Trump administration did at HUD. They got rid of affirmative furthering for housing and a number of other rules. They actually were supportive of Connect Home. And I think that's because no matter where you are, in terms of your side of the aisle, you can see that we need to make sure that everybody has access to broadband and how necessary that is. And we can do that in this country for everyone, and especially for low-income folks who oftentimes already have the odds stacked against them in so many ways.
Yeah, no, and I can't even, when I was reading up on, I remember when it was announced, but I was reading up on it to prepare for today. All that struck me was, without that initiative, right, so many families would have been lost during the pandemic, because that access to internet, doing schoolwork on your phone is really not going to happen. And lots of low income, children and kids don't have phones, and their parents may have phones, but they got to go to work, or they have to, so it becomes, or they're remote working, so it's amazing. You don't often at least in my experience, you don't often have initiatives that end up being so impactful, where you can really, like, something so dramatic happens that you see the impact of it. And so really tremendous work, and something that, we still have to fight, even in New York. There are neighborhoods that don't have great internet access and internet service, and it costs money too. Let's not forget that. And if you're low income in this country, a $50, $60, $80 a month internet bill is not, it's not a priority, right? It's not affordable. So, well, listen, I really appreciate you joining us. We will, have to find another topic to bring you back on, so that you can you have the pleasure of Kirk, and not just me on the other end. But congratulations on all the work that you've done over many years, and your voice is really important, and we're happy and thrilled that you shared it with us on the housing problem.
Thanks again so much for the invitation, and thank y'all for bringing more light to all of these issues. And let's hope that there in New York, here in my home state of Texas, and across the country, that there's more dedication, more attention, and ultimately more resources and smart policy to address the housing crisis.
Well, I hope so too. And if you're ever in New York, give us a ring, and we're happy to show you around a little bit, and what we're trying to do in New York. There's a lot of great work happening in New York, despite the challenges. And I know that's true in Texas, and I know that's true all over the country. So we tend to talk about the problems, but there are also lots of great solutions going on out there. And so it was great to talk to you about some of those as well. So
absolutely.
Wow, thanks again to former Housing Secretary Julián Castro, former mayor of San Antonio, Texas. What a great conversation, inspiring life story, terrific conversation that fostered lots of good thoughts about the role that the federal government can play and how it can help local communities. Really excited to be having great conversations like this with experts, both here in New York and across the country. And we hope these discussions will continue to lead to a deeper understanding of the housing problem and the potential solutions. We hope you're enjoying listening to The Housing Problem. I'm Rafael Sestero. And again, my co-host Kirk Goodrich had technical difficulties and wasn't able to join us, but please do contact us and find out more about affordable housing in New York at thehousingproblem.com. And please subscribe and share The Housing Problem, because the more we explore the housing problem, the better chance we have of finding the housing solution.
Produced by Paul Jamali. Executive producers Rafael Sestero, Kirk Goodrich, Eric Biederman, and Tom Corsillo. The Housing Problem podcast is a top content production from Marino PR.
Pizza's a good reason to miss an episode of The Housing Problem.